Welcome to the Science of the Endurance Athlete. My name is Lisa Heaton. I am a senior scientist and sports dietitian with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute.
And I'm Kelly Barnes. I'm also a senior scientist at GSSI. And in today's presentation, we are going to talk about the importance of energy, hydration, and protein for athletes, specifically endurance athletes. Then we'd like to talk a little bit about the specific nutrition needs that endurance athletes will have when training or competing for prolonged periods. Like I said, sport nutrition needs of any athlete can be divided into three categories: energy, hydration, and structure. However, the energy and hydration needs of the endurance athlete are unique and should be addressed as such. If we start with energy, we will give a brief overview of all athletes' needs, then specify what makes endurance athletes' needs and fueling strategies unique. Let me first show you why carbohydrates are important to you, the endurance athlete. This study shows that fatigue is postponed and performance is improved when athletes are fed carbohydrate versus water. This is through, 1, maintaining blood glucose levels, and you can see that on the graph on the left. Also through maintaining carbohydrate oxidation rates, or the ability to translate the fuel or the carbohydrate that you take in to usable carbohydrate in the muscle. And you can see that in the middle graph. The fed carbohydrate group may also spare glycogen in the muscle or the liver, and there's some evidence to suggest that it will help to maintain cerebral blood glucose supply. All athletes, all humans really, store energy in the form of fats and carbohydrates in your liver and muscle. Everyone, even the leanest athletes, have plenty of fat stores in their body, but it's the fuel for slower, usually less intense exercise. However, carbohydrate stores are limited, so eating carbohydrate helps support and replenish glycogen stores so you can keep training or competing at those higher intensities. Like I said, there's a finite amount of glucose or carbohydrate that can be stored within the body, and once those run out, without replacement, athletes will be forced to slow down to utilize fat stores or to stop exercise completely. We can measure fuel utilization in the lab. In general, as exercise intensity increases, carbohydrate use for energy increases and fat decreases, although you're almost always using a mixture of fat and carbohydrate. This graph is just an illustration of changes in the pattern of fuel use as exercise intensity increases. The point at which fat utilization decreases and carbohydrate utilization increases will depend on many factors for the individual athlete. However, even the athletes that can hold on to higher fat utilization at higher exercise intensities will still be burning more carbohydrates as the exercise intensity increases and will still need replacement to continue. To further that point, you can see in this study that as exercise intensity increases, the speed at which muscle glycogen use is used up is much faster. So this study shows varying levels of exercise intensity from 31%, which is that light blue on the far right, to 150%, which is that purple on the far left. The muscle glycogen is used up much quicker at the higher exercise intensities. Not only is exercise intensity important, but duration is important for fuel needs. And this is where endurance athletes become unique. As exercise duration increases, muscle glycogen decreases sharply, with a reliance mostly on blood glucose and plasma-free fatty acids for energy. Therefore, energy intake in the form of carbohydrates during exercise is critical for completion and sometimes performance. Now, over longer periods, like days, weeks, etc., we can adapt how much carbohydrate is stored in our muscles through the amount of carbohydrate in our diets. As you can see in this study, those athletes that took in higher carbohydrates in their diets, those indicated by the red, have significantly higher muscle glycogen levels than those that are indicated in the light blue and the yellowish orange, which are the low and the moderate carbohydrate diets. And they have the ones in the red with a higher carbohydrate diet had a significantly longer time to exhaustion than the other groups, which means that they could exercise for longer periods of time. This is considered a chronic approach, but there are also acute strategies involving carbohydrate feeding in and around the exercise occasion, and that'll be what we talk about in the rest of this carbohydrate section. There are a few ways that we can absorb carbohydrate through our gut. Glucose is absorbed via the SGLT1 transporter. This transporter can only sustain a rate of about 1 gram per minute or 60 grams per hour. We generally recommend consuming carbohydrate sources like glucose because they are absorbed quickly. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for a slow sugar like fructose. And because it has a separate transporter, the GLUT5 transporter, it can be absorbed in addition to the 60 grams per hour of glucose. Because fructose is slowly absorbed, you wouldn't want to consume much more than about 30 grams per hour. This combined type of carbohydrate is especially important for endurance athletes or those athletes that will be training or competing for more than about 2 to 3 hours at a time. Also, this is why carbohydrate recommendations aren't based on body weight, but are standard amounts based on your exercise duration. Now, this review set out to look at if you can use or oxidize as much carbohydrate as you take in, and also if the type of carbohydrate matters. The gray line in circles represent glucose only, and the black line in squares represent the combined type of carbohydrate sources of glucose and fructose. And as it turns out, the body's ability to use carbohydrate that we take in is somewhat limited as well. As I mentioned earlier, we are able to use about 1 gram of glucose per minute only. But if we have multiple sources of carbohydrate and glucose and fructose, we can increase that to about 1.5 grams per minute of carbohydrate. However, if we try to take in much more than about 1.5 grams per minute of this combined type, we don't seem to get any additional benefit, and we typically end up with GI discomfort. The blend of carbohydrate sources impact the osmolality or the concentration of the drink and how efficiently it moves from your stomach to your intestines. Having the glucose-fructose multiple substrate blend results in a faster gastric emptying, which can reduce that sloshing feeling sometimes athletes get in their stomachs after drinking. Now, lastly, fluid delivery may also be improved as carbohydrate blend improves fluid delivery compared to glucose alone. This study shows that the multiple sources of carbohydrate of glucose and fructose will empty the gut, as seen in the last slide, which results in getting into the blood faster than glucose alone and almost as fast as water. This means that it is usable by the body during exercise quicker. As a consequence of improved gut comfort, fluid delivery, and faster carbohydrate oxidation, this study shows that performance is improved, and researchers found that glucose and fructose combined drink improved performance by about 8% when compared to glucose alone, with a 19% improvement with the multiple sources of glucose and fructose versus a placebo during this cycling time trial.
So now that we've talked about the importance of carbohydrate and absorption through the gut, let's talk a little bit about how overall diet impacts the ability of the body to use that carbohydrate during training. There's little information in humans about developing nutrition strategies to improve carbohydrate absorption during training, but in this particular study published in 2010, the researchers looked at the difference between a low carbohydrate and high carbohydrate diet and the impact that had on carbohydrate oxidation during exercise. For the low carbohydrate, they used 5 grams per kilogram of body weight carbohydrate, and for the high, it was 6.5 grams per kilogram. In reality, 6.5 grams per kilogram really isn't extremely high, but that is the comparison they did in this particular study. What they found after the 28 days on the high carbohydrate versus the low carbohydrate diet was that the higher carbohydrate group had greater exogenous carbohydrate oxidation during exercise than the low group, and this was likely due to improved absorption overall. However, the intestinal transporters were not measured. That is what they hypothesized to be the reason. So let's look at what you can do to train your gut a little bit before competition or training starts. You want to start about 1 to 4 hours before your training or event begins. And you want to target 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. Now, not many people are going to be able to tolerate that 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram. Most end up falling somewhere between that 1 to 3 gram per kilogram range. But what you want to do is find the timing, amount, and type of carbohydrate that works best for you when you start your training. And generally, the closer you get to your training or event, you want to limit fat, fiber, and protein even more. These nutrients tend to slow down the digestion and absorption process, so you don't want to end up having more in your gut because your body hasn't digested and absorbed it. That's the reason we recommend limiting those the closer you get to your training. In the hour before the event, I didn't include that on here because we consider that really starting your fueling for training. But what I would typically recommend to an athlete is to take in up to about 30 grams of carbohydrate in that hour before they actually start their event. Now, if you're planning to do 2 training sessions in one day and have those training sessions be within 8 hours of one another, you want to make sure you're replenishing glycogen in between them to make sure you're able to get your maximum performance out of that second training session. So what we would recommend is 1 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour for the first 4 hours. So you want to make sure you're having a carbohydrate-rich snack each hour for the first 4 hours. And after that, you can resume your daily needs based on when your next training session is. So targeting those carbohydrate-rich foods and oftentimes beverages, because eating too much solid food can end up being overwhelming. So having a carbohydrate-rich beverage option is sometimes a really good strategy for endurance athletes. And having small regular snacks available to you are also beneficial. So looking at the during training or competition fueling needs, Kelly touched on this a little bit, but these are not based on body weight. These are based on your intestine's ability to absorb that carbohydrate. So again, it's not going to be grams per kilogram, it's total grams per hour on this chart. If you're not going to be training for more than 30 minutes, carbohydrate is likely not necessary. If you want to take a little bit in, that's entirely your prerogative, but it's not necessary, especially if you've fueled well beforehand. If your training is between 45 and 75 minutes, very small amounts may be beneficial to you. Again, this is really finding the form that you like, that you can tolerate well. If your training or competition is going to be 1 to 2 hours, we would say up to 30 grams per hour in this occasion. And because you're not saturating those intestinal transporters, most forms are likely going to be tolerated well. Now that we're moving into the 2 to 3 hour period, up to 60 grams is what we would recommend. And we're going to start focusing on those rapidly oxidized sugars, those things like sucrose, glucose, maltodextrins, ones that are going to move through the intestine at a rate of about 1 gram per minute, or a total of 60 grams per hour. If you're getting into training or competition that's over that 2.5 to 3 hour mark, that's when we'll start targeting that 90 grams per hour, that blend of glucose to fructose that Kelly talked about. You will see some overlap in the durations here, so that is where you make your best judgment call of what am I going to be doing. If I'm only going to be going for 2 hours and 45 minutes, probably be okay with that up to 60 grams. You don't need to go up to 90 grams. But if your training is going to be over 3 hours, that's when you would want to maybe start working towards that 90 grams per hour. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we do our case study at the end, but if you're an athlete who is going to be going out training for 3 hours and you typically don't take in much carbohydrate, I wouldn't recommend you immediately bump up to 60 or even 90 grams. You'd want to start slowly and work on training your gut to tolerate those amounts. If you bump up too quickly, this is carbohydrate and the same will apply to fluid intake, you're going to end up having some GI distress. So you want to train your gut to tolerate those amounts. So after looking at how much we should take in, let's talk about form. Is one type of product better than another? A gel, a gummy, a bar, a sports drink? There are all types of products out there that you can consume as an endurance athlete. In reality, different forms of carbohydrate have the same benefits and are absorbed similarly. So athletes have many options on how to keep their carbohydrate fuel stores at optimal levels. There is a caveat to this though. Some products, especially bars, may contain additional fat, fiber, and protein. These nutrients can slow digestion rate. A bar that is primarily carbohydrate, though, should perform similarly to other forms of carbohydrate. What I would encourage you to do is to try out products you're interested in during your training and figure out what will sit well with your gut when it comes time to compete. You want to understand what will work for you on race day to limit the chance for GI surprises. So looking at how we can apply some of these during exercise recommendations, I've put together a few examples here. So for a 1 hour swim, up to about 30 grams may be beneficial. Find where in that 0 to 30 gram range you want to fall. It might be 0, it might be all the way up to 30. What will work best for you? And with the swim, obviously there's some logistical issues there. So this could be you taking your 0 to 30 grams right before you get in the pool or right before you get in the water. For a 2-hour run, this is where you could start practicing that 30 to 60 gram per hour recommendation. And if you're going on a 4-hour ride, up to 90 grams. But again, you want to train your gut as you progress through your training plan to tolerate these amounts. So now we've finished talking about carbohydrate, and I am going to pass the presentation back over to Kelly to talk about hydration.
Now that we have discussed energy and how athletes get energy and use energy, and Lisa has discussed the optimal sources of energy for each exercise duration and intensity, we will now move on to hydration. Improper hydration, such as dehydration, can have many consequences if severe. The lack of body fluid can increase the strain to your heart and your cardiovascular system. It can also increase the use and need for glycogen. There's many ramifications to the metabolic and nervous system. And to make matters worse, dehydration can actually impair your body's ability to absorb and use the fluid that you take in. And of course, dehydration impairs thermal regulation and can put you at higher risk for heat-related illnesses. This 2014 review really emphasizes the importance of hydration for the endurance athlete. As you can see from the gray hashed lines, that is the amount of research studies that have been done on endurance athletes that have seen performance impairment at certain levels of dehydration. This impairment usually starts around 2%, but there seems to be greater consistency across multiple studies, with performance drops around 3-4% and beyond. 2% is often cited as a threshold, especially in the heat, because this is where physiological impairments start to be seen, and some athletes will suffer performance issues. However, some athletes may be able to tolerate slightly greater losses, and this is why practicing your individualized hydration is really important. Now, the best way to determine your hydration needs is by finding out how much you are losing through sweat. In this section, I'm going to explain what affects your sweating rate and hydration, and how to determine that sweating rate and your hydration needs, and give you examples of how this can change. There are two main things that affect your hydration: how much fluid you lose through sweating, and how much you take in. Temperature, humidity, and the environment and training status all play a role in how well you maintain body water or how fast you might dehydrate during exercise through sweating. Beverage temperature, sweetness, and likability will influence how much fluid you consume during exercise. To help maintain hydration, specific components of the rehydration beverage impact various steps in the rehydration process. The fluid you take in obviously helps to replace the fluid that you are losing through sweat. The carbohydrate in the beverage can help transport the water from the gut into your blood, like I showed you earlier in this presentation. And sodium will not only help to distribute the fluid, but it will also help you to retain fluid that you're taking in so that it's not just lost as urine. Now that you know how each component of hydration matters, let's discuss how to find out how much fluid you need during exercise. First, you'll need to find out how much fluid you're losing, and the simplest way is to test your sweating rate. Now, there's no gold standard for assessing sweating rate in the field, but the simplest way is to measure body mass change from pre-exercise to post-exercise. To do this, you'll need to know your weight before training, ideally nude, and you'll need to know the weight of the food and the fluid that you're consuming during this session. You'll need to know the mass of any urine or stool loss during the session, and it's probably easiest to get your body mass before and after the urine or the bowel movement. And then you need to know your post-exercise body mass after toweling dry, and again, ideally nude. Lastly, you'll need to know how long your training session lasted, meaning how long from the start of exercise to the end of exercise. After gathering all of your information, here's the formula to determine your sweating rate. You're going to take your body mass prior to training, ideally nude, and you subtract the body mass after training in kilograms, both of those in kilograms, and both ideally nude, and the second one ideally after toweling dry. You're going to correct for food and fluid intake and any urine or stool loss, all over your exercise duration in hours. In this way, you'll get your liters per hour of sweat loss, or your sweating rate. Now, if you're not as into numbers as I am, you can just direct yourself to the GSSI website listed here, data.gssiweb.com/fluid loss, to get detailed instructions, as well as an online calculator to help. Now that we know how to determine your fluid, how much fluid you lose, let me quickly show you how to figure out your hydration strategy. We'll start with our scratch pad, where we have figured out that we lose 1.5 liters of sweat during our training session based on the pre and post exercise body mass. Based on the first check on the right-hand side, we know that our exercise was 90 minutes long. And based on that second check, we know that we're losing about 1 liter or about 34 ounces of sweat fluid per hour. You can see that calculation on that second check, like I said. We are training to run a 4-hour marathon, as you can see on that third check. So we know that, and we know that the marathon that we're going to do is going to be in a similar exercise intensity and environment as the sweat test that we took, so that we always want to do them in the same situation as we're going to be competing, so that we can translate those results to what the competition results likely will be. And so based on that 4-hour marathon, we will lose over that course of that 4 hours about 4 liters or about 135 ounces. Now we know that we don't want to lose much more than about 2% of our body mass, which, as you can see from that scratch pad, our starting body mass is about 70 kilograms or about 155 pounds. So if we take 2% of that weight, we get about 1.4 liters or about 47 ounces that we want to stay within that. So we're going to subtract that from the total 4 liters that we need over that marathon, which is going to give us 2.6 liters, which you can see in that fourth check, that we need to consume over the 4 hours. Or as you can see in the last check, we need about 650 milliliters per hour, which is about 220 milliliters every 20 minutes. And in ounces, that last check is going to look like this. We lose 134 ounces, like I said, over 4 hours, minus the 47 ounces that will get us to no more than 2% dehydration, which is going to be 88 ounces total that we need to consume over 4 hours, which would be 22 ounces per hour and roughly 7 ounces every 20 minutes. Now, here's a study that we've been conducting at GSSI over the last 18 years. This study shows some of the variety in sweating rates that we have seen in over 1,300 athletes. In this study, we cover many ages, body mass, tests in all kinds of environmental conditions, from cool to about 15 degrees to very hot at 50 degrees Celsius, which is about something like 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and in low humidity to high humidity. In general, it's a pretty comprehensive group that results in quite a spread in sweating rates. This just shows that no two athletes sweat alike, and that we need to personalize hydration strategies to each athlete, meaning that we need to understand sweat fluid losses by sweating rate calculation and hydration strategy by something like the slide I just showed. Now, not only are no two athletes alike in their sweating, but the same athlete's sweat profile can change over different exercise intensities and different environmental conditions. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that in the following slides. So this slide shows how sweating rate changes over the course of 3 different environmental conditions: cold, moderate or cool, and hot, and a low exercise intensity and a high exercise intensity in each of those. As you can see, it starts off pretty low in the low intensity exercise in a cold environment. As you increase your exercise intensity, sweating rate also increases. As you increase temperature, sweating rate increases, with even more increase with higher exercise intensities. And in the hot conditions, they're even higher. Now, if we compare those two extremes, the low intensity exercise in a cold environment to the high intensity exercise in a hot environment, you're going to see that fluid losses and thus fluid replacement needs are very different. So from the low intensity cold environment, you lose about 1 liter or the fluid equivalent of 1.4 bottles of Gatorade Endurance Formula. To the hot environment, high intensity, you lose about 2.2 liters or about 3 bottles. And that difference is 1.2 liters or about 1.7 bottles of Gatorade Endurance Formula per hour. Now let's say that we're doing a 3-hour event. What is that going to look like? Over 3 hours, this is 3.6 liters different, or about 5 bottles of the fluid of Gatorade Endurance Formula different. Now, I know that it's harder to measure sweat sodium, but here's an example of what it would look like. If we combine sweating rate and sweat sodium concentration, the total sodium that we lose is going to follow that same fluid loss. So low intensity, cold environments, lowest, and it increases as exercise intensity increases as environmental conditions get hotter. And you can see that the difference, the highest or the lowest to highest, is about 1,080 to about 4,097. And that's in just someone that sweats moderate to the high side. And this difference is just a little bit more than 3,000 milligrams, which is just shy of 4 whole packets of Gatorade Gatorlights per hour, which is also the sodium equivalent to 5 bottles of Gatorade Endurance Formula. And to get that 3,000 milligrams of sodium in Gatorade Thirst Quencher, or the standard Gatorade, you would need 11 20-ounce bottles, which is 220 ounces, which is way more fluid than we would ever recommend taking in. Now, if we take that over the course of 3 hours, this difference could be equivalent to over 11 packets of Gatorlights worth of sodium. Now, let me summarize this section. So this study, I think, does a nice job. Scientists separated out 2 questions. 1, does fluid replacement affect performance? And they found that fluid versus a gel or a pill resulted in 6% faster time to complete a time trial. Their second question was, does carbohydrate affect performance? And they found that carbohydrate gel and Gatorade performed better than the pill or the electrolyte water by 6%. Now, these results suggest that hydration and carbohydrate are not exclusive for performance. Both fluid and carbohydrate ingestion equally improve cycling performance, and their effects are additive. Now, let me summarize the hydration section for you. During exercise, you should practice your hydration strategy. You should know your sweating rate in different environmental conditions and in different exercise intensities. You should expect to lose some weight during exercise due to dehydration. That's completely normal. However, you should try to drink enough fluid throughout exercise so that you don't lose more than about 2% in hot conditions of your body mass and no more than about 3% in cooler conditions when possible. Now, we know some athletes lose so much fluid during exercise in competition that there's no way that they could replace even that amount. But we want you to get as close as you can to those percent dehydration. We would never recommend anyone drink more than that they are losing. So again, you really need to know how much you're losing so that you can customize your hydration strategy. We recommend that you include sodium to increase the likability of the drink and to help you retain the fluid. And we recommend focusing on additional sodium intake when exercise is prolonged, like greater than 2 or 3 hours, and when sodium losses are high, if you know that. And then throughout the day, around your exercise occasion, we recommend drinking gradually and avoid drinking too much too quickly. Now I'm going to pass it on to Lisa to talk about structure or protein.
All right, thank you, Kelly. We're switching into the structure portion now and looking at how we are taking care of our muscles and our bodies outside of that training occasion. So to start, let's look at the basics of what we call protein balance. The muscle is always turning over. It's in a balance of muscle protein synthesis or building and muscle protein breakdown. And we often think of exercise in relation to the breakdown side of things. When you train, you're tearing down your muscle tissues, and that's what we would consider breakdown. But a benefit to exercise is it also helps to upregulate that muscle protein synthesis or building new muscle tissue. But we also need to deliver the amino acids or the building blocks of the muscle tissue from food because we can't make all of them. The essential amino acids are ones that we have to actually get from food, and we don't store any excess, so regular intake of protein is important to support the muscle protein synthesis process. So looking specifically at recovery post-training or post-competition, the criteria that we look through for what the best protein is for you is that, is it a complete protein? Is it rapidly digested and absorbed? Because different proteins are absorbed at different rates. And is it rich in the amino acid leucine? The proteins that fit this profile the best are whey and milk, but that doesn't mean that other sources aren't beneficial as well. We've just seen through the research that whey and milk are the best for stimulating muscle protein synthesis post-training. And the reason we call out leucine specifically, this is a branched chain amino acid. So it is a building block for muscle tissue, but we also know that it is the signal to start or ignite that muscle protein building process. So it is important to have a protein that is rich in the branched chain amino acid leucine to help kickstart that process. So we've talked about the criteria for the protein, but how much? Around 20 grams is appropriate for most athletes. So this is based on a number of different studies, but in two more recent ones, they've extrapolated out based on body weight how much is likely appropriate for most athletes. And the number they've come to is 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram. So looking at two different body weight athletes, a 210-pound male versus a 135-pound female, times that 0.25 grams per kilogram, we get roughly 24 grams for the man and 15 grams of protein for the woman to take in as soon as they can, as soon as they feel that they can tolerate it post-training. So you can see that that averages out to pretty close to that 20-gram mark, but there can be a little bit of tailoring based on your body weight. Beyond that immediate post-training protein intake, we'd recommend that you do take in another 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram, roughly every 3 to 4 hours to continue that muscle repair and rebuilding process. So beyond protein, what are some other things that could be beneficial to endurance athletes? And these aren't necessarily specific to recovery. Some of these are things that you could take in pre or potentially even during training. But these are a few ingredients that we've seen in the literature to potentially have some beneficial effect for you. I'm not going to get into specific amounts, but just highlight really what the potential benefit is for these specific nutrients. So caffeine, reduced perception of fatigue, so it allows you to sustain exercise at your optimal or desired intensity for longer periods. Sodium bicarbonate is an ingredient that we refer to as a buffer. It helps to improve performance in events that would otherwise be limited by disturbances in your body's acid-base balance. As you exercise, the environment can become more acidic, so the sodium bicarbonate helps to buffer that. So this is really beneficial in high-intensity events of about 1 to 7 minutes. So if we're thinking about a high-intensity sprint during an endurance event, that would be the occasion where a buffer like sodium bicarbonate could be beneficial. Beta-alanine is similar in terms of improving performance in events that would otherwise be limited by that acid-base balance disturbance. For nitrates, it can improve exercise tolerance and economy. So particularly we see this in more of the non-elite athletes versus the elite athletes. This is one area that there is still ongoing research looking at exact dosages and how that would impact non-elite versus elite athletes. And for vitamin D and omega-3, this is an area of research that new information is continuing to emerge around both inflammation and muscle protein synthesis recovery for athletes. So now what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about the Gatorade Endurance product line that the Gatorade brand has created. There are products for different potential usage. So we have several products that contain energy from carbohydrate as well as electrolytes. But these specific products don't provide any fluid or hydration. There is the Gatorade Endurance formula, which has fluid, electrolytes, as well as carbohydrate for energy. And then we also have the Gatorlytes, which are an electrolyte-specific product. So let's dive into these a little bit more. The Gatorade Endurance Carb Energy Drink and the Gatorade Endurance Carb Energy Chews are fairly similar in composition when it comes down to carbohydrate and electrolytes. There's 30 to 31 grams of carbohydrate per serving and 105 to 110 milligrams of sodium per serving, depending on which product you're choosing. Both options provide quickly oxidized carbohydrates, as well as those key electrolytes to help replace what is lost in sweat. The big difference comes back to form. We talked about this a little bit earlier, finding the form that works best for you. The Carb Energy drink is a 4-ounce pouch that contains fluid, as well as the carbohydrate and electrolytes. This really is a great product for before, when you're preparing for competition and you're sitting in the corral just waiting. It's a nice way to get a little bit of fluid in as well as some carbohydrate before you start. The Carb Energy chews are a more solid form. There are 4 chews in each sleeve. They could be used before but also during your training as well as your race as an option to take in some carbohydrate. Whichever you choose to use, make sure you're practicing using it in your training. The newest product in the Gatorade Endurance line is the Energy Gel that was released fairly recently. But again, it's another form of quickly oxidized carbohydrate that you can consume before or during training. This particular product has about 20 grams of carbohydrate and 100 milligrams of sodium, so it's providing that fuel and electrolytes. The texture of this is a little bit different than some of the other gels on the market. It's less thick, so it has more of a light, easy to swallow type profile. The Gatorade Endurance formula, this is the hydrating beverage. It comes in either powder or ready-to-drink form. This product was reformulated fairly recently to be a 2-to-1 blend of glucose to fructose. So thinking back to when Kelly was talking about maximizing intestinal transporters, this product was designed with that thought in mind. So it's a 2-to-1 blend of glucose to fructose to help support those fueling needs up to 90 grams per hour. This product also provides electrolytes to replace what is lost during training and competition. So endurance athletes who are competing for longer durations tend to have higher losses of electrolytes just because of the nature of the sport and how long they're out there. So this product was designed to replace those losses. Endurance formula was reformulated to contain no artificial flavors and have a lighter taste profile. The final product in the Gatorade Endurance line are Gatorlights, and Kelly used this as an example for sodium losses during training. This product is designed for our endurance athletes who are competing for very, very long durations or are just extremely salty sweaters. It has a very, very high concentration of sodium as well as potassium, and then again, it's meant to replace those very high losses. This product is meant to be mixed into a beverage like Gatorade Thirst Quencher. Although I have seen some athletes just shoot the little packets, I don't recommend that though. It's a very, very salty flavor profile, so it can be a little bit intense. So ideally you would mix it into a Gatorade Thirst Quencher beverage. So looking at endurance formula, that beverage that we were talking about, compared to traditional Gatorade Thirst Quencher, and we've abbreviated them GTQ for Thirst Quencher and GEF for endurance formula, there are some differences between the two. Both have a concentration of what we would call 6% or 60 grams per liter. So looking at the label, if you're looking at carbohydrate, they're going to look like they have the same amount, which is true, but the sources of carbohydrate in those products are different. Traditional GTQ is made with dextrose and glucose, whereas Gatorade Endurance formula was reformulated to be a 2-to-1 blend of glucose to fructose. So while the concentration is the same, the sources are different. When it comes to electrolytes, on that bottom row, Gatorade Thirst Quencher versus Gatorade Endurance formula. Endurance formula has almost double the amount of sodium and almost 3 times the amount of potassium compared to Gatorade Thirst Quencher. And this, again, goes back to the nature of the sport. When athletes are going to be training and competing for longer durations, those electrolyte losses are going to be cumulatively higher. So we have more electrolytes in this product to account for that. So finally, what we'd like to do is introduce you to John. He is our case study. He's a 28-year-old male. He's an elite competitive age group triathlete. And I've included on here what overall his daily nutrition needs are based on the guidelines set by the American College of Sports Medicine and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I've picked places within the ranges they recommend for him based on the type of training he's doing. He's a triathlete. He wants to compete in a half Ironman. So we're looking at what his needs are to support his training. And this is a snapshot. So the amounts, the grams per kilogram, may change based on where he is in his training and how close he is to his competition. But this is just a basic outline of what his needs could potentially be. We've also included on here sweat rates and sweat sodium concentration. So John has done a sweat test for running and biking and then taken his fluid losses also for swimming. So competing or training at a temperature of 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% humidity at close to his race pace While running, he lost around 1.7 liters per hour, and his sweat sodium was around 1,600 milligrams per liter. On the bike, in similar conditions at close to his race pace, he lost roughly 1.5 liters per hour of sweat, and his sweat sodium concentration was 1,200 milligrams per liter. Now, for swimming in about 78-degree water, he lost, we're going to say, approximately 0.9 liters per hour. There's some logistical challenges to doing sweat rate in water. Some athletes do swallow water as they swim a little bit, so that could throw off the balance because we can't account for how much they actually consumed. And for sweat sodium concentration, that logistically wearing a patch while you're swimming, there's a lot of factors that could impact it. So we don't have an estimated or calculated sweat sodium concentration for swimming. So looking at John's history, when he has competed in the past, he's had a lot of GI issues. And that can come back to a number of different things. If he's trying something new on race day that he's never had before, that's a big no-no. We don't recommend that you do that. It could be the type of carbohydrate he's taking in, or the volume of fluid he took in, or simply he didn't train with what he was going to do on race day. So we want John to work on training his gut, because your stomach is an athletic organ and can be trained to tolerate more fluid and carbohydrate. But we want you, and I mentioned this before, to increase slowly throughout your training to avoid that GI upset. So similarly to progressing through your training plan, you should work to progressively increase your fluid and carbohydrate needs or intake to meet your needs. So here's an example of what John can do. This is a training day where he planned to swim in the morning and run in the afternoon. His swim is planned for 6:30 a.m., so he's likely not going to want to wake up 3 to 4 hours before he gets in the pool to eat a very large breakfast. So we targeted 5 a.m., about an hour and a half before he plans to get in the water, with carbohydrate at the lower end of that pre-range. So for him, that comes out to about 77 grams of carbohydrate. And then looking at how much fluid he needs, 7 to 11.5 ounces of fluid. He likes coffee. He likes the idea of caffeine, so we've chosen coffee for his pre-swim fluid source. And then a primarily carbohydrate-based breakfast, so toast, jelly, honey, a banana, to get that carbohydrate on board because he just woke up from his overnight fast and we need to get more into his system. During his swim, he's not going to be able to, or not likely to, drink fluid during the swim portion of his race. So we told him just have fluid ad lib, put a bottle of water at the edge of the pool, and if he wants to stop periodically to take sips, that's fine. Otherwise, we can make up for any fluid losses he has at his post-swim meal. So post-swim, he is planning to run within 8 hours of finishing his swim, so we want to make sure we're getting a good amount of carbohydrate on board. So at 7:30, after he gets out of the pool, he has some carbohydrate. He really likes oatmeal. He adds ground flax seeds, blueberries. He adds vanilla whey protein powder to get some additional protein into that post-training meal. And then he consumes water to make up those fluid losses from his sweating rate when he was in the pool. He can repeat this if he feels like his swim was extremely taxing for those up to 4 hours. He didn't feel like he went extremely hard in the pool, so we kept this meal small and then added a snack at 10:30. So for convenience sake, he has a fuel bar with him, an individual package of low-fat milk to get some protein, and then he can drink water throughout the morning as he feels necessary. Lunchtime, you can probably guess based on the food options where he maybe went to have his lunch, but we want him to have a carbohydrate-rich meal here to help him prepare for when he goes for his run in the afternoon. So something like a burrito bowl where you have brown rice, you have pico de gallo, you have some vegetables, some beans, you can add guacamole, lettuce, all those things. You're getting a good amount of carbohydrate in that meal, and then also having some protein in there as well. He added the chicken breast as his main protein source in this, and then consuming water as he prefers. His run is scheduled for 2:30, so because he had such a large meal at lunch, he chose not to take anything in that 30 minutes before, which is okay because he had such a large lunch and it was only 2 hours beforehand. Now, his run is only planned to be 90 minutes, but because he knows he's going to be out on the course longer during the race, we've decided that it's important for him to begin practicing to get up to that 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So our target for this particular run is 60 to 80 grams with around 1 liter of fluid an hour to accommodate his sweat rate. He's not matching it, but he's trying to offset those losses a little bit. So he's chosen Gatorade Endurance Formula, as well as some water to meet those fluid needs. And then he also is bringing along a Gatorade Endurance Energy Gel for some additional carbohydrate. Post-run, we want him to focus on that protein for recovery, as well as getting a little bit of carbohydrate on board. Because he's not going to be training again until the very next day, I'm not being as specific with how much carbohydrate he needs to take in here. His general daily diet for the rest of the day should help replenish those glycogen stores, but he should have a little bit here as he prefers. So he's chosen kind of a trail mix popcorn, and then he also makes a Gatorade Whey isolate protein powder shake just to get a little bit more protein in that recovery snack. For his dinner, he makes kind of a mixed plate of meat, starchy vegetable, and a non-starchy vegetable. Water, he has a little bit of dessert to treat himself here. And then before he goes to bed, I've encouraged him to have an evening snack. It's a little bit higher in protein because you're going into that overnight fast. So you want to have some protein on board to help delay when your body gets into that really fasting state. So you're not breaking down muscle tissue for as long overnight. So while it may be polarizing to some people, he's chosen cottage cheese with peaches as well as some low-fat milk to get up to around 30 grams of protein. So now let's move into John's race day plan. So the swim kicks off at 6:30, similar to what he did with his training, but he's getting up a little bit earlier so that he can get to the corral in time. So he's having his pre-swim breakfast at 5 a.m. Again, he's sticking with what he did in his training. So he's having coffee, he's having that toast, jelly, honey, a banana to get that carbohydrate in, and again, the coffee for the fluid. At 6 a.m. in the corral, he's taking in a little bit of water, and he's also choosing that Gatorade Endurance Carb Energy drink because it provides a little bit more fluid than something like a gel or a chew would. He doesn't take anything in during the swim, so when he comes into the first transition, he has a small amount of Gatorade Endurance Formula ready for him to take as he goes off on his bike. His plan for on the bike is to consume up to 1.5 liters per hour of fluid and up to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. We're going to try and maximize what we can get into his system on the bike where he's relatively stationary with his upper body. So he's choosing around 1 liter an hour of Gatorade Endurance Formula and 0.5 liter an hour of water. And then he's also taking those Gatorade Endurance Energy Gels, 1 per hour, to get that additional carbohydrate. Now, we've set up to for all of these amounts because I want him to listen to his body. If his gut is telling him he cannot tolerate this amount, I do want him to scale back because the last thing we need is for him to get on the run with a sloshy gut or not feeling well and then having issues there. In transition 2, again, he has a little bit of fluid ready for him. This time he's chosen water because he'd been doing the endurance formula and energy gel on the bike, and he's planning to continue that on the run. So he's having a little bit of water in transition 2. Then he starts the run. Now, you'll see we've recommended up to 1 liter per hour of fluid, which is less than on the bike, even though his sweating rate is higher. And that's just because of the nature of the activity. There is more jostling of the upper body when you're running, and he's had issues, GI issues in the past on the run portion. So want to make sure we're giving him amounts that he can actually tolerate versus always trying to closely match his sweat rate. We do want to try and keep him from losing too much, but we don't want to overload his gut either. So for him, again, he's doing a mix of Gatorade Endurance Formula and water, and he's continuing with those Gatorade Endurance Energy Gels because he practiced with those and he knows he tolerates them well. Post race, I want him to take in carbohydrate and protein here just to help him from a recovery standpoint, but because the race is over, I'm giving him a fair amount more freedom in what he chooses. As long as there is some protein and carbohydrate in it, he can go out and celebrate that he finished this race. So what I really want you to take away from here is experiment and adapt. So look at what you're doing in your training. Pay attention to your exercise intensity and duration. What did you take in? Roughly when did you take it in when you were training? What were the environmental conditions? How did that impact how much fluid you were losing? So periodically doing a sweat test to see how much you need to replace after and how much you lost during. Come up with a rating scale. How did you feel? How did this go overall? For your training itself, how did your gut feel? And add comments so that when you look back and see, oh, I thought this worked really well, but actually I felt like this. And then potentially doing some pre-races, some ones to test out your training plan to see, are there any tweaks I can make for my big race? And then include nutrition as part of your race event and report, so you can always go back and make tweaks for the future.
I hope you enjoyed our presentation today. It was pretty comprehensive in many areas. However, we just did not have the time or the space to cover certain aspects. And some of those that we weren't able to cover today are diets for endurance training and performance, specifically the low carb, high fat diet or carbohydrate loading. We didn't have a chance to discuss carbohydrate periodization or train low strategy, and we didn't get very far into planning for hydration strategies, nor were we able to touch on supplements in the when, the how, the if, and the why. If you have any questions on any of these topics or anything that we covered today, please direct them to the GSSI scientist involved.